Hello. This is my critical analysis number five discussion. This last couple lectures, we actually talked about plant hormones and photosynthesis. Um, First, we talked about the plant hormones and plant hormones. They signal molecules within plants that occur in extremely low concentrations. They're formerly known as plant growth regulators, and then phytohormones. And then they control all aspects of development, including organ size, pathogen defense, stress regulation, and reproduction. Um, all plant cells can produce plant hormones. Um, Most photosynthetic organisms have phytohormones, but some are actually treated as secondary metabolites. And unlike animal hormones, plant hormones will not always have a localized function. Once they're produced, they will travel through the plant's vascular system. Um, and then we also have, your phytohormones. Their transportation occurs in two stages, which is cytoplasmic, which happens between cells, and seed tubes and or phloem, and that happens throughout the plant. So the first hormone we talked about was the abscisic acid, ABA for short. Um, this hormone is actually produced in mature leaves, especially under stress. Um, they're known like their their main functions are are included in stress response, stimulation of stomatoclosure. Um, they inhibit premature germination of seeds. They're involved in embryogenesis, and maintenance of seed dormancy. It's important to note that release of ABA causes cells to release water and causes the stomata to close. And the stomata are like little pores on the surface of leaves. Um, and they're surrounded by two guard cells, and then they actually control the retention of water and uh, gas exchange as well. They're involved in gas exchange. Um, the next hormone we talked about was auxin. Um, they're involved in cell elongation, cell differentiation, apical dominance, fruit formation, lateral root formation, and adventitious root formation. Um, so yeah, auxin um, is actually a super important hormone, especially for um, the growth of a cell and also reproduction as well. Um, excuse me. Um, the next hormone we actually talked about was the cytokinin. The cytokinins are actually produced primarily in the root tips. Its main function is involved in cell division, and it also plays a role in tissue culture and delaying leaf senescence. Um, Cytokinin and auxin actually have an interesting relationship. Um, both both levels of auxin and cytokinin, as they both increase, there'll be a lack of differentiation between like sister organisms. Um, so yeah, that's kind of the interesting relationship between those two. Um, we then talked about ethylene. Ethylene is super important in food, actually. It's produced in most tissues under stress, senescence, and ripening. That's the food part of it. That's super important. Um, its main functions are fruit ripening, leaf and flower senescence, and leaf and fruit abscission. Um, which is the controlled separation of the plant part from the main body. Um, so as ethylene increases, your your fruit will become more ripe. Um, and there are ways that you can uh, cause like an increase of ethylene to make your fruits riper. One old trick is to put your fruit in a bag. Just put it in a bag and seal it off, and the ethylene will cause that fruit to ripen faster. And then the last hormone that we discussed was gibberellic acid, GA for short, which is produced in young and developing shoots and seeds. And its main function is also involved in cell division, cell elongation, and stimulation of seed germination. Um, and GA also has kind of a commercial use. They use it in markets to make fruits look more attractive, to make fruits look larger, and it helps clean. It helps clean fruits easier. Um, So that was basically that was a brief overview of what we talked about hormone wise. And then the next lecture we actually talked about photosynthesis, which was a very important process for plants, not only plants but the environment as a whole, organisms as a whole. Um, Super important process. And then we talked a little bit about a few other things. So first, we kind of learned about the important, excuse me, importance of photosynthesis, which photosynthesis is an anabolic, energenic, carbon dioxide requirement process that uses light energy in the form of photons, and water to produce organic macromolecules, typically in the form of glucose. Um, This means that plants are autotrophic because they go through this process themselves, and provide their own energy. They just convert the solar energy into their own energy. Um, and this process actually occurs in the stoma and mesophyll cells of of a plant's leaves. More specifically, it occurs in the chloroplast. Um, We also briefly talked about why plants are green. It's because of the presence of a pigment called chlorophyll, which actually harvests energy from photons, by absorbing wavelengths. And the one, like like I said, photons are being absorbed, but the one photon that's not being absorbed, that's actually being reflected, is at a specific wavelength that reflects the color green. So red, blue, pink, yellow, orange, all those wavelengths that correspond to those colors are being absorbed, but the wavelength that corresponds to green is the one that's being reflected. Um, so yeah, and then chlorophyll is actually responsible for that green color. Um, and then we also briefly talked about why leaves change color in the fall. That's because the green chlorophyll pigments are actually greatly reduced, um, and that actually helps reveal the other pigments. Carotenoids um, are antenna pigments that end up being revealed during the fall. And that's why we see leaves that are red and yellow because of carotenoids. Um, so on the photosynthesis, we know that photosynthesis can be divided into two processes, which is a light dependent reaction and the Calvin cycle. Um, the light dependent reaction actually produces energy from like directly from the solar power from the photons in the form of ATP and NADPH. Um, this reaction occurs in the thylakoid membranes and has cyclic flow and non-cyclic flow. Cyclic electron flow uses photostem 1, P700, which we call it P700 because um, it's at the 700 nanometer wavelength, I believe. Um, so yeah, that's why it's called a P700 reaction center. Um, and then it also uses the electron transport chain, and it only generates ATP. That process only generates ATP. The non-cyclic reaction flow uses photostem 1 and photostem 2. And photostem 2 can also be known as the P680 reaction center. Um, Applying the same logic to the P680, um, it happens at the 680 nanometer wavelength. Um, the non-cyclic reaction um, flow also uses electron transport chain, and it generates ATP, NADPH, and O2, oxygen gas. Lastly, we talked about the Calvin cycle. Um, the Calvin cycle does not use light. Um, some people call it the light independent reaction, but it does not use light, but it uses the energy that's that has been produced from the light reaction um, in the form of ATP and NADPH. Um, it also uses carbon dioxide, and the Calvin cycle occurs in the stroma, which is kind of like, if I had to describe, I kind of describe it as kind of um, the empty, the unoccupied space of the chloroplast. Um, you have thylakoids in the chloroplast, and then around the thylakoids are is a stroma. Um, so yeah, the Calvin cycle. To produce glucose, it takes about 6 turns and uses 18 ATP and 12 NADPH. We talked about the different plants, which are the C3, which is about 80% of plants. You have CAM, which makes up about 5% of plants. Excuse me. And you have C4 plants, which make up about 15% of plants. And all these plants use the Calvin cycle. Just some of the processes are slightly different. You have C3 plants that use Rubisco, um, while C4 and CAM plants use PEP carboxylase to fix carbon dioxide. Um, the C3 plants are more effective, only using 18 ATP, requires less energy. Though they do require more carbon dioxide and water. And then your C4 plants are less effective, using more energy, using 30 ATP as opposed to 18, but they require less carbon dioxide and water than your C3 plants. And CAN plants are in a similar boat as C4, in which they require more ATP than the C3 plants, but they actually absorb less carbon dioxide and require less water. So that's kind of the what we went over in our uh, most recent modules. So